Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to one of the key events of Mid-Ulster Enterprise Week, a webinar for the next hour about how to cope with the current economic volatility. My name is Mark Simpson, and for the next hour, we're going to hear from a fabulous panel, but we want to hear your questions too. I've got a couple, I always do. I'm going to ask them, but we're going to use the Q&A function you should see at the bottom of your screen, not the chat function, the Q&A function, to put any questions you have to our panel. Very experienced panel we have. They have all the answers. I know that. Trust me, I'm a journalist. You probably recognize them, but let's go through them. We have Feargal McCormack, the award-winning Managing Director of FPM Chartered Accountants. He's a man who once said, we must innovate or we will evaporate. We must innovate or we will evaporate. Gavin Kennedy, he's a very experienced business finance consultant. He used to be head of business banking at Bank of Ireland in Northern Ireland. Welcome, Gavin. Speaking of Bank of Ireland, we also have with us a current employee. Mark Cunningham is head of regional business centres at Bank of Ireland. He has a wealth of experience in issues like retail, healthcare, property, hospitality. So if that's your thing, the next hour, please ask your questions. As I say, use that Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Thank you for joining us. It's great to see so many people on what is quite a nice day out there in the middle of November. We're exactly in the middle of November. I don't need to tell you about the economic challenges that lie ahead, but I would like our three panelists to tell us a little more about themselves and give us one top tip to cope with the next 12 months, starting with Feargal. We'll start with you. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Mark. And as you said to me, I founded my own part-time secretary just over 30 years. Average organic growth. In terms of any economic crisis, economic volatility, a good time to perhaps look at our business and focus on what I would suggest are the three elements: reflect clearer, respond bound faster.
Feargal, I'm sorry to interrupt you. We're having a little bit of a problem with your line. We'll maybe do that behind the scenes and come back to you after hearing from Gavin Kennedy. Gavin, while we sort out that little technical glitch, tell us a little bit more about yourself and give us one top tip.
Sure. Thanks, Mark. Good afternoon, everyone. I suppose after 26 years in Bank of Ireland, I decided to set up my own business consultancy and to take good use of the experience I got over all those 26 years through the economic cycles and advise clients on raising debt, restructuring debt, and managing their finances. So that's been a very interesting journey over the last 2 years. Very exciting, working on some great projects with some fantastic Northern Ireland-based clients, and on some global projects. So that's been really invigorating. Some people ask me, do I miss the bank? Not so much, but it's definitely in the same arena in terms of the area of finance. So I suppose, Mark, in terms of dealing with economic volatility, there's probably a number of things for me in this, and it's very hard to distill it into one tip. You've asked for one tip, which is very difficult, but in terms of, for me, for businesses anyway, I mean, there are the facts, and we know what the facts are in terms of the inflationary pressures, putting up material costs in terms of input costs, the war in Ukraine, and obviously higher energy costs, which is a huge factor for many manufacturers, obviously. There's almost full employment. So that's upward pressure on wages and in the labour market. And then there's obviously the recent hike in interest rates. So the cost of debt is higher. And I suppose many businesses post-COVID have had disjointed supply chains, they've had uncertain cash flows, and many are coming out of COVID actually with more debt in terms of the government debt, CBILS and bounce back loans. So they're the facts. I suppose then you have to look at the impacts that has, and a lot of it is around reduced margins, increased overheads, I suppose lower profitability potentially, and then reduced cash generation. And the impact that has is obviously if a business is carrying debt, it becomes more difficult to service and repay that debt. And it may cause those different factors, and there are many impacting on business at the minute, may cause cash flow difficulties or may give rise to working capital requirements. So that's the impacts, and the impacts and the facts are pretty much given. Then it's what we do about it. Well, I suppose for me, that level of all those factors give rise to uncertainty. And I suppose the only way to deal with uncertainty is to try and become more prepared. And for me, the key to being prepared, no matter what size of business it is, no matter what sector you're in, all businesses are different, but there are some key fundamental disciplines. And for me, there's three. You have to have up-to-date financial information, whether it be annual accounts and obviously management accounts. If you can have monthly management accounts, even better, but at a minimum quarterly. The second point is to interrogate and analyze those management accounts. And that's to spot trends and take action early. And the third thing is to do projections. And a lot of clients say to me, sure, what's the point? We don't know what's going to happen. That's kind of the point in doing projections. So we model and we say, well, if I lose that big contract that I have, what's the impact on my business? If my second biggest customer doesn't pay me, what happens? If sales fall 20% because there's less consumer spending, what does that do to my business? If interest rates go to 6%, what happens? So it's those type of models and scenarios. And I think the key thing at the minute particularly is, if you look at your management accounts and you do those projections, I suppose the key thing is, from a funding perspective, make sure that if you're in difficulty or if you think you might breach a financial covenant that's in your loan documentation, speak to your funder early. So get that out on the table and be prepared. So I suppose if I put that all together, for me, Mark, is being prepared financially. I mean, you'd be surprised the number of clients approach me and say, can I raise debt or can I restructure debt? The first thing I ask them is, so what financial information do you have? And they've nothing. It's out of date, or it's not available, or it's whatever. It's the first thing a funder is going to ask for. So again, be prepared. That level of prepared in terms of projections will allow you to deal with the uncertainties, the blips that occur, and the unexpected. So I suppose, in short, get on top of your numbers.
Get in touch of your top of your numbers. Well, I think we've got on top of the technology. Feargal, you're back. We interrupted you. Apologies.
I hope the technology still not good.
Keep going.
I was going to say, I hope the technology in an economic crisis or indeed in a period of
I'm sorry, Feargal, it's still not great. I'm sorry, it's still not great. We will try one more time. We'll go to Mark Cunningham. Mark, tell us a little bit more about your banking background and also your top tip.
Yeah, Mark, as you said, I head up the regional business centre teams for Bank of Ireland. So that's really everything in business banking outside of Belfast. So we have a team in Newry, a team in Derry, specifically in Mid-Ulster, we have a team in Macrophelt, a team of 10 headed up by a chap called Ian McCann. So a lot of what I'm doing at the moment, Mark, is out and about with customers, which I think is really, really important at the moment, because as Gavin had touched on, there is a lot of uncertainty out there, and people do want to listen and get advice, and that's a lot of what we're doing, is sharing that with people at the moment. And when I think about, like a top tip, I suppose one of the things I hear quite often is people say that it's just time to keep the head down and get on with it. And I am a great believer in getting on with things, but I think keeping the head down is maybe not the best idea in times like this. My approach is this is very much a time for heads up, and it's being aware and getting information. And I suppose for me, the top tip is it's all about information, not dissimilar to what Gavin had said as well. But I would go maybe a little bit wider. So you want to be gathering information on all your customers and who you're trading with, and to make sure there's no surprise on that. Information on your suppliers and make sure your supply chains are robust. And as suppliers, I would also count your bank in that as well. So make sure you engage well with them. Wider information on the market that you deal with, and make sure you're fully up to speed on all things that are happening with your sector. And also try and gather information from your peers and other businesses in the locality. And I think that's one of the big benefits of events like this today, that you will get to hear things that other people are going across. And, you know, now is maybe not the time to try anything massively new or revolutionary or unique to try and innovate within your business. But if you see something that other people are doing that is working really well, just copy it. That's a time that you can really do copy something that is good from other people. So I suppose, in summary, for me, it's about information. It's about being a sponge and gathering a lot of that information up and then acting on it and making sure that you are taking appropriate action on the back of that.
And just to pick you up on that, Mark, and it'd be interesting to hear, hopefully we got Feargal back. He's the man that says that there's never a bad time to innovate. Is there a happy medium? Are you saying to people to hunker down and don't try anything new, or are you saying just don't be too ambitious?
I think, Mark, it's important not to go off the scale at the far end on this. And innovation for me is just doing things differently. If you see something that somebody else is doing differently, I think that will work for me. Copy it, be a fast follower. It takes a lot of the risk out of things. If you're trying something that you've never seen anybody do before, this is maybe not the right time to do that. I suppose that would be my guide for anybody.
Feargal, third time lucky. Can you hear us?
I can hear you. I hope you can hear me. So
keep going.
What I was saying was that economic vitality of the time to take a business and to focus.
Feargal, I'm sorry. I hate doing this. Honestly, it just isn't quite right. We may try one last time. I picked up Mark on a point. I want to pick you up on a point, Gavin, as well. This point, and we will go on to the positives that can come, in the next 12 months. But I was very interested in you saying to businesses, almost write down what your worst nightmare is. The things that keep you awake at night. What happened if so and so left, or so and so was no longer a customer or a supplier. Are you saying, maybe even organize a meeting to talk about the what ifs, or at least have a list somewhere? Could you just expand on that a little bit more?
Yeah, sure. I mean, you can't cover, I suppose, Mark, every eventuality, but what you can do is business plan. And by that, I mean, if you look at, as I said at the top, every business is different and they have a unique set of circumstances. So you may have one large customer, or you may have multiple. So if you have customer concentration, that will lead you to naturally look at that and say, well, if my biggest customer either fails or goes somewhere else, how does that impact on my business and my cash flow? It also then, if you are exposed to one large customer, it may drive you to take action to diversify, to try and find new customers, to dilute the potential impact of that. But I mean, right across the board, I mean, I suppose it's not just in terms of the nightmares, it's in terms of even if in a positive scenario. So, I mean, let's face it, there will be opportunities in the next 12, 18 months as some businesses' competitors will drop out of the market. So if you're taking their place and actually growing, well, there's also financial implications to that as well. So it's not just, when I say business plan and do the projections and trying to think of the different scenarios, they're both positive and negative. But just in the current environment, there are so many negative impacts. I suppose I'm focusing on that primarily because that's probably the element of danger that applies to most businesses just now.
A confession here. You maybe know what I do in my day job. I'm a broadcaster. I work for a public sector corporation. You can maybe guess which one. So it's very easy for me coming into the private business world and then giving advice or anything. But I could imagine if it was me, looking at the economic situation, I hate to say it, Mark, I probably would keep my head down. I would hunker down. What I have, I hold, and I probably would do nothing new, Gavin. Can you understand that? Is that the right attitude? What do you think? Mark, chip in, but I mean, I can understand the temptation to do that. But what I would say is, and again, this is rather boring, but you can probably guess what I'm going to say, which is, can you afford to scale down? Can you afford just to stand still?
I mean, if you have debt, for example, I mean, that is that's an animal that you have to feed. So therefore, you have to have a certain level of business. You may not just be able to scale back. You may not be able just to stand still, Mark. So again, there will be factors affecting individual businesses that will drive them to make decisions. But again, what I would say is if you work through that process with your advisors, to try and understand the key levers that you need to pull, the strategic drivers that you have, well then, you know, and again, internally in firms, there may be an internal accountant, there might even be a financial director, but those people, doesn't fall on them to make all the decisions. And what I would say is there are advisors to take advantage of to help them scenario plan, do that strategic think, and I suppose plan as best they can. And the more planning you do and the more scenarios you investigate, the better prepared you're going to be for whatever happens.
Mark?
Yeah, look, I think sometimes in the current environment, you know, if you've previously had expansion plans, you know, that sometimes can be the first thing that maybe goes by the wayside. And like, I get that sometimes that can be an understandable reaction. But what I would kind of coach people to do would maybe not give up too quickly on that type of thing. I think, you know, a good business will generally have a strategic plan, which, you know, that they will work towards. And, you know, that will have short, medium and long-term objectives within it. So I think it's important to review your strategy whenever you encounter some kind of difficulty. Have both medium and long-term objectives. And by all means, you know, think about options and flexibility and build those into it. As Gavin had said, you know, through scenario planning or sensitivity analysis. But I would always be reluctant to, you know, guide people to abandon those unless you're in an absolute battle to survive, and that's all that matters. You know, most businesses are going to get through this, okay, Mark, and you will have something that you've devoted time and energy to in terms of a medium-term plan that you can go back to. So, like, I would be keen that people, you know, don't just throw that by the wayside. You know, there's also a temptation for people just to keep going the way it is, as I said, you know, keep the head down and batter on. And you know, I think we're in a landscape at the moment which is changing more rapidly than it's ever done before. And what's worked well in the past for you, it's probably less likely to work as well if you're going forward. So your market is going to be affected, and it's going to be changing. And I think, you know, you'll need to do that as well. So just doing what you're doing is probably one of the ways to do it as well. But Gavin touched on kind of scaling down to survive as well. And I think that's a pretty interesting one, because it's one of the things that we would have seen certainly in Bank of Ireland over the last number of years with COVID. Like, there was quite a number of occasions I would have come across businesses, whether through labour shortages or supply chain issues or things like that. They took a step back and looked at the type of business they were involved in, you know, what goods or services they were providing. And many of them, for the first time, took an opportunity to reflect on, like, what are these lines really delivering for us? You know, and many businesses as a result of that probably emerged a little bit leaner. Yes, sometimes on occasion they were a bit smaller, but they were more profitable than they've been before. So I think it's important that at this time, businesses optimize what they do and really use this as an opportunity to focus on where real value lies within your operations.
And Mark, while you're on, what about somebody that says, I need money? Is the bank really going to help me in the current environment?
Yeah, look, it's a really good question, Mark. Like, I'm long enough on the tooth to remember back a few different cycles like this. And if I go back to 2008, you know, it's one of the things that we hear quite a bit, you know, will you guys support them? Because there's question marks, I suppose, in how many different financial institutions reacted back in those days. And I think, you know, there's a lot of cause for being reasonably certain that we will provide the right level of support to businesses. And I think there's a number of different reasons for that. Like, I think the fundamentals for a great many businesses are stronger than they would have been, you know, when I look back to 2008. You know, a lot of uncertainty then, but a lot of businesses in those situations were fairly heavily borrowed and you know, maybe overextended. And the banks were exactly the same. Like, we were probably overextended. We're operating off a low capital base and a weaker balance sheet. And ironically, it's one of the things that I think increased regulation that's come to bear over the last maybe 10 or 12 years has actually left us in a much better position from a banking perspective to be able to provide that level of support. Banks are no longer really worried about, well, will they survive? And I think there was a lot of cases back in 2008, 2009 that the banks were looking inward as much as anything else. So, from a capital perspective, we are in robust shape. And I think that goes for the vast majority of funders, and they have to be. Going back to that bit about scenario planning and sensitivity analysis, we do a lot of that now. We're obligated to do that through regulation, and that's not a bad thing. It means that in the event of things happening, like uncertainty that we're going through at the moment, banks have only one thing to worry about, and that's making sure that customers succeed and survive through this.
Thanks, Mark. Gavin, I want to hear your thoughts on this in a moment. But first of all, Feargal, I see you're in a different room on a different device. Has it worked?
Same room, but different device. How are you, Mark? How's that?
Go for it.
Yeah, so just putting in your second question there to the boys, I do think that it's fair to say you may decide to continue at your same size and not grow. However, in my experience, standing still itself doesn't work. So it may well be that you've decided to re-engineer your business, which could be okay, downsizing, but it shouldn't be just because of the current economic crisis, because long term, you've got to make sure you're fit and your business is fit, because the fittest will survive and we will overcome this current crisis. But I do think without doubt that we have to be realistic. Some of the most successful businesses in Ireland, Glen Diplex, Ryanair, they started actually in economic crisis. So I think if the solution is purely to downsize, that's wrong. But if you haven't carried out a major review of your business, that is the right economic and strategic objective to take place, yes, but not just purely to downsize because of the economic crisis at present.
And is there a happy medium, Feargal, of not being too ambitious, or would you still say the sky's the limit? If you've got a good idea, no matter what the economic climate, go for it.
Well, I think the economic climate itself should not determine it, but we always have to look at what's happening outside our business. So I think whilst it's important to dream, it's important to be aggressive and to go for things, we must also have balance and to realize what are the risks. So one of the really big factors in times of economic volatility is to consider risk assessment. But having considered risks, well, I would say don't let an economic crisis stall you from getting on with it.
And just while you're away, Gavin was talking about the various what ifs. I'm sure you've had, maybe you're a very good sleeper, a few sleepless nights about the what ifs if you lose a customer or a client or something bad happens. How have you done that on a practical sense over the years? Have you notes somewhere? Do you ever have meetings about, the scenario planning, or do you carry it all around your head?
Well, I think scenario planning is very important, and the what ifs are key. Very important, that thought leadership process. You think of different alternatives. However, I've got to be honest, from about 2000, I haven't lost a wink's sleep due to business. And because I've managed to get myself into a positive mindset that says, if I give it my best today, if I look in the mirror tonight and I give it my best, even if it didn't work, well, I couldn't do any better. So basically, I've got now into my mind that whatever I do, every moment make it count and give it my best. But there are many occasions that doesn't work out, but you go the next day. You must have confidence in your team. You must have confidence that whatever the challenges are in the future, that together you can get there. And so I'm a firm believer that, adopting a negative approach, looking back negatively doesn't work. You have to have a positive mindset, and more importantly, embrace that with your team and discourage negativity. Get rid of negativity. I have no core example where negativity worked.
And two last things that I want you to comment on. One is this whole idea of copying other people's good ideas. Where do you stand on that?
I have no issue there, actually. Copy and do it better, because I think actually, you to put it bluntly, you should always be willing to learn from your competitors. And in my experience, actually, your competitors can be your best friends. Both of you can actually do far better. I think it's a false apprehension and a fear to think to look at other people's success as jealousy. The opposite. Embrace those successes, learn from them, and enhance your own organization to go by them. Because, it's a bit like sport. You got to keep focusing on winning. And if you keep focusing on winning, it won't happen every time, but it'll happen most times.
Quote of the day. We've got a question, and I'm going to go to that in a moment. I just want to very quickly, in case we forget, because it's a vital issue, this whole issue of access to finance. I know it's not directly an issue for you, Feargal. I'm going to go to Gavin in a minute on this, but would you have any comment on access to finance at the moment?
Yeah, I think that obviously I'm involved in the lot, and both Mark and Gavin, I would allow them to talk more specifically. But there's a couple of very common problems that you experience quite often you're dealing with businesses, because I'm obviously in between the business and the bank a lot. And I suppose the very first one is that we need to pause and ask, why do we need the funding? Okay. It's amazing how many people ring you up and say, get me this and get me the other, get me a bank overdraft. When actually a bank overdraft is the last thing they want. So the truth is, the business must stand back honestly and say, why do we need the funding? And then once we understand why we need it, then what type of funding is most appropriate? Now, in my experience, to be fair to bankers and other funders, and let's be fair, there's a lot of other funders as well out there, and I know certainly Gavin and Mark will be very familiar with those. In my experience, funding is not the issue. In my experience, funding can be secured if the proposition stands up and makes sense. Actually, I go forward to say, in 30 years of business, I'm not aware of any project that deserved funding that didn't get it.
Interesting. Thought for the day. Feargal, it's good to have you on board. We didn't waste a minute there. Gavin, how do you follow that?
Well, as usual, after Feargal, with great difficulty. What I will say is I wholeheartedly agree with his comments around cause. I mean, it's a bit like Mark phoning the doctor and saying, I need some medicine. For what? Why? How long has it been going on? Root cause and all the rest. So I completely agree with that. In terms of access to finance in the Northern Ireland market, I think it's quite positive. But going back to first principles again, as Feargal said, what is it for? So is it property finance? Is it for an investment? Is it for a factory extension? Is it development, which is a specific niche, and many players operate in the development finance world? Is it working capital? So is it debtor finance specifically, or is funding stock on a seasonal basis the key thing to your business? Or is it capital expenditure driven? Is it heavy plant and equipment that you constantly need to invest in? So as asset finance is your key product, and then you can go to many specialists in that space. So I think, funny, I thought you might ask about access to finance, and I have a slide. I don't know if we can just flash it up briefly. But there's some of the. Obviously, Mark, Bank of Ireland are number one there clearly, but for your benefit. But there are a number of operators in the Northern Ireland market. They do have specific requirements, and they are niche in some cases. Some are more expensive than others, and they all have their criteria, and that's fine. And I suppose what I would say is there's probably three key tips for me in terms of accessing finance. One is understanding your requirement, which Feargal has rightly mentioned. The second thing is in the financial information and how that's presented and analysed, which is the second key plank. And the third one is getting access to those correct funders for whatever your requirements, your specific requirements are. And I suppose if you get those three in order and correct, then I don't think there's any barrier to access to finance, frankly.
And Gavin, could I come in there and add a fourth one, which I think, to be fair, is what you're saying, but the fourth one really is having an understanding of what the lender is actually looking for and what risk assessment they will actually carry out, because those are the four. And that's to clarify my earlier point, Mark. What I'm saying is, if you get those four right, that's a high bar, by the way, but if you get those four right, your chances of funding success are exceptionally high.
Exactly. And to be fair, so for example, there are a number of products out there, for example, that are perfect for the current scenario that we're in. So recently, I was involved in a case where there was an asset finance, existing asset finance commitment of 1.2 million spread across more than a dozen assets, and the repayments on that were £345,000 a year. So a heavy commitment. And what we were able to do was to do a sale and HP back of that, all those pieces of equipment in one go, and reduce that and reschedule that over 5 years, and effectively reduce the repayments from 345,000 a year to 210,000 a year. So a significant cost savings. Now, any accountant in the room will say, well, look, that's obviously going to cost you more in interest. And yes, it will. But the purpose of that restructure was to allow that business to invest further in more plant and equipment, not cripple the cash flow, and that further investment into new kit and new technology would make them more effective and more competitive. And that was and that product isn't widely known about, but again, specialist assets finance, some firms are prepared to do that. And that, I suppose, is getting in front of the right people who have access to those funders. But as Feargal says, it's all about how you present the information and what the benefits are to the business, and then to make the lender comfortable with their credit assessment.
I want to go to Mark to see if he's anything more to add before we leave access to finance. But either Gavin or Feargal first. Again, maybe it's because I'm not a business person, but I look at that list, I really wouldn't know where to start. I mean, do you go to someone like you, Gavin, and ask for advice, or go to a business mentor?
Yeah, well, I think it's a valid point. And again, going back to the internal accountant and financial director within the business, I mean, it is impossible for them to know all the funders' criteria, who is most suitable. So yes, I mean, I think when it comes to funding and access to funding, I think people should rely on external advisors, FPM, for example, or myself, or whoever, and rely on them to understand their requirement, articulate that in the correct way for that particular funder, and then get access to that funder. But I think, in terms of the access, I think is there. I think what we need to navigate probably a little bit better is the route to the information provided and the route to the funder. And yes, no doubt, other people can help. External advisors can certainly help. But again, going back to first principles, it all depends on what the initial requirement is.
Quick word from you,
Mark. Yeah, I would come in there and say, Mark, to be fair, and I think this is important in any form of business planning. The fundamental point is your first application is your best application. It's your best chance. So the worst thing you can do is run to a funder not prepared. You're far better pausing and getting it right. And therefore, what quite often happens is somebody, our bank always took this before, I'll just throw a sheet of paper in or whatever. It's extremely difficult in that environment to add credibility to that funder when an external person then comes in. So my honest advice is quite bluntly, very straightforward. Pause, go and talk to somebody who you trust, and try and understand what is the funding you're looking for, why you're looking for it, and who can help you. And only when you've thought those things out, believe it or not, that pause and planning will ultimately significantly enhance the speed and the ability of you to secure funding, and more importantly, the appropriate funding. And we're forgetting one other point. It maybe is good to get a third party to tell you that they don't like your proposition. That's maybe good. You can actually learn from that and go back again, or reshape it a little bit, or rebalance it, or carry another risk assessment. It never does any harm long term to get a third party opinion on what you're thinking. Because remember, in my honest experience, whenever you go to any funding applicant for money, funding organization, your first approach is your best. Whenever you have to keep coming back and clarifying more questions, clarifying, what does that say? That say you didn't get it right the first time. Yeah.
If you're explaining, you're losing. Mark Cunningham, it's great to have a bank in the room. I'm sure you have a lot to say on this. You maybe a bit more to tell us about Bank of Ireland.
Yeah, look, I think that was a really interesting slide that Gavin put up there. I didn't count, Mark, but I think there must have been about 20 different institutions on that. And I think back to the last financial crisis, like how many of those guys were in the Northern Ireland market at that stage. There's probably maybe 5 or 6. And actually, I think that's a really positive thing. And you might think that's a crazy thing for me to say because there's more competition. But one of the things that we probably realized, we can't be all things to all people, and nor should we try and be. the role that we at Bank of Ireland look to play is generally that we are secure debt providers, and and the reason for that is generally the debt that we will provide will be relatively inexpensive compared to maybe some of the other guys on that list. And that's because and both of the guys have referenced their uncertainty and risk, and I throw money into the equation as well. There's a really simple equation that I talk to people about a lot, and it's risk equals uncertainty multiplied by money. So that's risk equals uncertainty multiplied by money. And we have a certain level of risk at Bank of Ireland that we are comfortable taking, and that's where we want to play. And other lenders out there will have different levels of risk that they're willing to do. But the one big factor is often that the level of money that people need is reasonably well defined. To make sure you're getting the right risk parameters, you need to shrink the uncertainty. And we've talked about uncertainty a lot. I actually have a slide as well, if we maybe throw it up. And this is something that I will talk to customers about when I'm out with them. These are the things that I think you need to focus on whenever you want to shrink that uncertainty. So just to make sure that whatever proposal that you're bringing to a bank or another funder meets their kind of risk parameters and where they're comfortable with. And, touching on what Gavin and Feargal have both said, we don't always expect a customer to know exactly who the right lender is and the right risk appetite that different people might have. And that's why very often whenever things come into us from, either a consultant like Gavin or from FPM or somebody like that, it's a really positive thing, because we know that proposal will have had a significant degree of challenge before it even lands with me on my desk. Neither of the two guys are ever going to put forward a proposal if they think it's a waste of time. And that critical friend, before it arrives at a bank, is a really, really important thing. So I think we're in a much more mature banking and funding market than we would have been back in 2008. And I think, going forward over the next 6-12 months or whatever, that kind of support that we're able to provide will be very much helped by getting good quality and well-vetted proposals coming through to us.
Thanks, Mark. We're going to move to a specific in terms of access to funding. Thanks for your questions. Keep them coming in. We have about 20 minutes left. Malachi's asked about the mini budget from Liz Truss. Remember her? We'll maybe park that for the moment and maybe talk a little about the autumn statement, which is coming on Thursday, and the impact that might have on the overall economic landscape before we go. But first, Joseph has asked a specific question. I'm not sure if this is maybe best for you, Gavin. For certain businesses who may do capital projects in the hospitality industry, can any of the speakers advise on grants available and an additional type of access to finance? Who's best to talk about that?
Well, in terms of the grants, wouldn't be my forte, but in terms of accessing different, again, I mentioned there's certain specialists in the market for plant and equipment and on asset finance. So depending on the nature of the capital project for hospitality, but there are firms out there who will fund, kitchen fit outs, for example. Not exactly the sexiest of an asset class, but definitely essential in the hospitality sector. But those types of assets can be funded by certain firms on competitive rates, but which may not be generally accessed from normal funding institutions. So there are specialists in that regard. In terms of the hospitality sector, which has been hit obviously and impacted by COVID, or again certain institutions that will take a view on the asset if it's strong enough and not have as much of a stress testing or a credit assessment on the underlying trading if they're comfortable with the asset. So again, it very much depends. It's very specific to the project, but there are certain funders who will take very different views to traditional banks, and I think that's very important in the scenario that we're in currently with all the different economic pressures.
Mark, I would say re-grants, to be honest with you. We'd be quite familiar with grants. To be fair, to answer a grant question, you need to know the exact specifics that it's relating to. However, depending on the size of the organization, basically there are different grants available depending on their their activity within the non-Ireland hospitality sector. There's some activities eligible for grant, some others aren't for capital grant. But what I'd suggest is that I was going to say later on, we'll say it later, but and give a reference to it. We're certainly offering a free health consultation, and if the individual gives us a ring, I'm very confident. Hospitality is a sector we in FPM are very familiar with. We work closely with the Tourist Board and indeed Invest NI. So I'd be surprised if we can't give a pretty specific, clear answer to that query if we knew the specific circumstances. So rather than talk about it openly in an open webinar, I suggest the person makes contact privately and we see if we can help them out.
Thanks, Feargal. Do you want to play an episode of the blame game here? Malachi's question: how much is Brexit and Liz Truss's financial car crash responsible for the current financial situation? A lot of people seem to blame COVID and Ukraine and ignore the other elephants in the room. Just a quick word on that, Feargal. Do you agree or disagree?
Well, I think to be honest, we have to put it all in context, and you can really look at UK, Europe, America, and the rest of the world. In simple terms, in UK and Ireland, certainly the pandemic, which everybody's affected by, Brexit has had an impact. There's no doubt about it. Ukraine and cost of living is also important. However, I think it's widely accepted now that Liz Truss's budget, or mini budget, as you like to call it, it was an own goal. But, you know, as I say, our current circumstances don't determine where we go, only determine where we start. So I think now is the key. We are where we are, and we have to make the best of it. And I do think the autumn statement is going to be looked at with much interest. And I do think that the government, indeed any government now, has to put in place measures which the markets will have confidence in, but equally will hopefully stimulate in due course growth. But I think being realistic, there's a black hole there, and we can't leave it to future generations.
Yeah, Malachi's back there about the autumn statement. Gavin, first you, then Mark. Anything particular you're looking out for? Obviously, it's going to be UK-wide, and maybe some of the things that we need to happen locally can't happen at the moment because we've got civil servants mainly in control. What are you looking out for on Thursday? I think it's about 12 o'clock. Jeremy Hunt, the Chancellor's getting up. Mark, do you want to go first?
Yeah, happy to, Mark. Look, I think one of the biggest issues that we encounter at the moment, and a lot of feedback we get from customers, is about energy, both on the domestic end and business customers as well. So a little bit more clarity on that would certainly be helpful. I think we're living in a little bit of a short-term environment on that. And as you say, that there is a bigger question then locally about how those kind of things will be implemented and impacting our businesses. So that, I think, would be a major, major help for local businesses if we can get a little bit more clarity around that.
Gavin?
Yeah, I think taxation is always a difficult one, and I think people will be scrutinizing that, particularly businesses that are reliant on consumer spending. And you know, anything, the cost of debt that has increased in terms of mortgage rates, the energy that we've already spoken about there, and then taxation is the other key, I suppose, factor that hits people in the pocket. So businesses, I think, would be very interested to see what the implication for that is for the consumer, and then the knock-on implication for their business services or products.
Thanks, Gavin. We're nearly done. We've focused a lot on the challenges ahead, the hurdles, the obstacles, but just to finish, I'll go to you first, Gavin. Just looking ahead, I mean, overall, are you still positive?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think, Mark, having been through a number of cycles, I would observe that Northern Ireland businesses are very robust and have been very resilient. But, you know, the market has been battered by COVID. Sorry, Malachi, but it has. There's, I suppose, we're now in another period of uncertainty and volatility. So, I mean, I don't know if you saw the Ulster Bank PMI output there recently that said, you know, orders are down, output is down, and business confidence is down. So you can't ignore that, I suppose. But for me, I think the survival, I don't think it's the survival of the fittest. I think it's the survival of the most prepared. I think that if you do the basics and stick to the basics, I think most, and Mark's already alluded to it, you know, most businesses will come through this. It might be quite painful, but I think they'll survive. I think there's an innovation and creativity in Northern Ireland, which is hard to beat. I think if you stick to the basics and seek help, there is a huge amount of support for businesses in the professional arena in Northern Ireland, and is there to help. And I can't remember who made the quote, but it was something like when nothing is sure, everything is possible. I'm not saying everything.
Ooh, I like that.
Well, I'm not saying everything is possible in the funding world, but there certainly is quite a lot possible. So I wouldn't be despondent. I think you have to acknowledge the challenges, but again, as Mark says, if instead of sticking the head down, if you get all over the basics and be prepared as you can, then I think you'll come out the other side.
Let's go to Mark. I'm going to give Feargal the last word on all of this. Mark, looking ahead, still optimistic?
I think cautiously optimistic would probably be the way I would describe myself, Mark, at the moment. Look, I think there are clearly a lot of issues out there. I think one of the good things is a lot of those are out in the open now, regularly talked about by, news articles and business commentators. And I think there's enough evidence that there's reasonable levels of government support and, central bank action and things like that. So a lot of those things are being dealt with. I always look at 5-year swap rates because that's one of the things that we sensitize repayments by whenever we're in the bank, and those have started to come back over the last couple of weeks, and I think that's a positive sign as well. And I think there's a number of fundamentals that I think would give us kind of reason to be optimistic that this might be a relatively shallow or short recession. And I think I look at, many businesses are entering this period in a relatively good position from the perspective of liquidity and debt levels. They're not overborrowed, and I think that's a very different scenario to maybe what we might have encountered in the past. And as I touched on before, I think banks are in a better position to support. And I think, there are no other issues for us to focus on really at the moment than providing the right level of support and making sure our customers succeed. So we're very motivated to do that. And we are out and about a lot talking to people and are keen to talk to more people about what we can do to support and guide them through this period.
And if somebody hears something today and they want to get in touch, Mark, how do they do that?
You can either contact me through LinkedIn or through any of our branch network or business centres. So everybody in the bank will know how to get hold of me or my team. So more than happy to have a conversation with anybody. And
you're offering a consultation if anybody needs it, yes?
Absolutely.
Yep. Feargal, what about you? I think you offered something earlier on, or did I mishear you? What were you saying?
Yeah, I think we can put up a slide there at some stage, but certainly we're offering a free consultation clinic. If anybody wants to contact us at any time, you can see the email address there, businessfunding@fpmaab.com. I'm in Northern Ireland. Ireland is a relatively small place. Most people will know each other, so people feel free to contact me. I think, to be fair, Mark, but looking to the future and confidence, it's fair to say that we can't control all the events around us, but we actually can control how we respond to them. And I think that will ultimately distinguish and differentiate the businesses that come through this well. And, if we're really being honest, business hasn't changed. You can take the skin off most businesses, but the issues are exactly the same. 30 years ago, I think the first time I was ever asked to speak at a business conference, it was an accountancy thing, and I chose the topic. I don't care how much you know until I know how much you care. And I'm convinced, by the way, today, more than ever, that's the key to life and business. It's all about people and relationships. And I would suggest to you, to be honest, as sure as night follows day, to be realistic, if we're being honest, individuals will make choices every day. And those individual actions will matter and will be a force for change. So if you look at Northern Ireland, and we look at UK and the Irish economies and the more global economies, the truth is that all the economists, I think, are suggesting that the UK will take a little bit longer to come out of the recession than most of the competing markets. However, and this is a very important point, I think Mark has nailed it. This is not like 2008, 2009. Businesses are a lot better prepared for this current crisis. And in my view, basically, they will come out of it, because in the north of Ireland, and Northern Ireland in particular, to be honest, we have come through far worse over the last 30 years. Resilience, or 50 years, resilience has always been there. but not blind resilience. We have to be realistic. We have to observe what's happening around us and try and show an agility that allows us to be fitter than the business next door. So to put it bluntly, I think wasn't it Martin Luther King who always said, the time is always right, Mark, to do what is right.
Feargal, that's the email address there if folk want to get in touch, businessfunding@fpmaab.com. We're going to leave that up for 30 seconds and then come back to you. But Feargal, I want to ask one more question, because you made it very clear that you sleep at night. You don't have those worries. Other people may not be as robust or as experienced. What would you say to someone either tuning in live, or this is going to be recorded, it's going to be on the council website, that says, well, that's okay for you, you know, you've climbed a few mountains and got over the other side. What about me? I am actually a little bit scared about the future. What would you say to them today?
I would honestly say to them to pause, take a few breaths in, and have confidence in themselves. And if at that moment they're still feeling that anxiety or stress, because I don't want to say I don't feel anxiety during the day, I do regularly, but my advice is talk to a friend, talk to a business colleague. There is nothing, thankfully, in business that can't be addressed. You know, life is precious. You know, perhaps my attitude changed because of a severely autistic child or something, but you know, whenever you put things in context, business can be addressed. You can change business. You know, I say the day I'm not happy driving to work, I'm not going to go anymore. I might do something else, hopefully. So really get back into the situation of positivity, control yourself. You can control this. If this is controlling you, you need a little help. And to put it bluntly, there's nothing to fear. There's nothing to fear. But there's a lot of opportunities out there. And when we get the clear head, go for a walk. It's amazing what we can do the next morning.
A lovely note on which to end. Feargal McCormack, Gavin Kennedy, Mark Cunningham, thank you all very much indeed. You took all the questions on the chin, some great advice, some great quotes there. Thanks to Mid-Ulster, thanks to the council, thanks to Enterprise Week. If you're watching this online, live, you can watch it again because it's going to be recorded. It's going to be on the council website. Wherever you are, thank you for your company and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you very much.